Hey, what's up, everybody? This is Ned Bellavance, Ned1313 on Twitter, and welcome to the Daily Check-In. So glad that you could join me today. Today is Tuesday, May 19th, 2020. Had to think about that for a minute, but that is where we're at. It is Tuesday, and that means it's Terraform Tuesdays. That's exciting. So every Tuesday, I will talk about a different topic within the world of Terraform, and perhaps you're preparing for your Terraform certification, or you're just curious about Terraform in general. And I am talking about the product from HashiCorp in case you weren't sure. So we're going to talk about that today, and specifically, we're going to talk about looping constructs within Terraform. So that's what I want to talk about today. Before I get into that, a couple housekeeping things, or actually just one. Um, I still have some 30-day passes to Pluralsight. I think I'm down to 5 at this point. So if you are interested in learning more about anything that Pluralsight has to offer, I have these 30-day passes. I'm down to 5. Hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn. I will give you the code and a redemption page, and it's like no strings attached, 30-day, redeemable pass. So that's still out there for the next, few people that reach out to me. So that's all I had to do with housekeeping. I also want to check in with you and see how you're doing. It's Tuesday, and that's always exciting for me because it is not only Terraform Tuesday, it's also Taco Tuesday. So if you are like me, you like to have tacos on Tuesday because it's alliterative and that's the sort of thing you like. So if you do, let me know. If you have some other Tuesday tradition, let me know about it. Hit me, leave something in the comments. Tell me what you do that's special about Tuesdays. Otherwise, Tuesdays are kind of a drag. Maybe that's why I dress it up so much. I don't know. Anyway, now let's talk about looping constructs in Terraform. And I'm going to have to refer down to my notes a little bit for this because even I get this confused. Within any programming language, a fairly common thing to do is to loop. You may need to do the same thing multiple times. Now, that's usually more important for imperative type languages. Think of something like, just basic. Basic had go to loops where you would go through a series of things and then at the end it would say go back to the top of that loop. And that's not great because it's a line number dependent. So we got rid of that and we introduced things like for loops and while loops and do while loops. Those all make sense in their own context. When Terraform was just a young lad skipping through the Andes, it didn't have any looping constructs really, except for the count construct. And the count construct was there. It's called a meta argument. It was there to create multiples of resources. So if I wanted to create 10 EC2 instances, I could do that by specifying a count argument, meta argument within the EC2 resource configuration block, and then it would create whatever number of those resources that I specify. So if I say count equals 10, boom, I've got 10 instances. Now, within that context, it has an enumerator that tells you which iteration you're on for that loop, for that count loop. And that iterator is count.index. So within that resource configuration block, you can refer to count.index, and you might do that to name your instances. So each instance might be my cool instance, and then you would add on the count.index at the end. So it would be my cool instance 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. Okay, that makes sense. So at a very basic level, you initially had count, and count was for creating multiple resources. It would also work, I think, maybe for data sources if there was really a use case for that. It would not work for modules. So if you had a module and you wanted to create multiples, you just have to add that module multiple times in your configuration. So that's count. And you would use count if you have a bunch of resources that are very, very similar in nature, might just be a little bit different, and you're going to use that count.index to supply the slight difference, the slight tweak for those resources. Okay, makes sense. Introduced in Terraform 12.6 or something, it was around that time, was the for each loop. And this was very similar to the count loop in the sense that it was for creating multiples of a resource. But rather than having a numerator that you would just go, 10 times through, and the only thing you had to refer to was that count.index, now for the looping construct, you are giving it a map or a list. And I think it has to be a map now that I think about it. Look that up. But basically, you're giving it a map of values, and it will iterate through each entry in that map and then use the values stored in each entry for the configuration of that resource, which gives you a lot more control over how that resource is configured. But it also means you already have this pre-created map for your resource. So if you wanted to create 5 EC2 instances, but they were all fairly different in their configuration, you could use that for each loop to do exactly that. And then you would have a map that has, instance 1 as the key, and then a value might be a list of values to use for that EC2 instance. That could be one way of going about it. Or you might have a map of maps, and in that map, you have all these individual keys. So there's different ways to do that. As it iterates through, it has a special value called each, and each has .key and .value. .key is the name of the key that it's using for the current iteration, and .value is the value that corresponds to that key. So that's how you refer to the keys and values in that map. So if you are creating a bunch of resources that are somewhat different but all of the same type, then you might use for each to do that and hand it a carefully constructed map of some kind. So that's 2 ways to create multiple resources using looping in Terraform. Hopefully that all makes sense. There's 2 other looping options in Terraform, and I'm going to talk about the for loop first. Now, you might be very familiar with a for loop in a conventional imperative programming style. You would usually start with a iterator. So you'd say for I equals 0, and you just set I equal to 0, let's say, while I is less than some value. And then how much do you want to increment I by as it goes through each loop? So if you wanted to do the example of 10 instances, you would say for I equals 0, while I is less than 10, I plus plus, and then you would have the actual things that are happening in the loop, and then I would end up hitting 10, and then it wouldn't execute the loop on that last run because now I is 10, so it exits the loop. That's how a traditional for loop would work. In Terraform, for loops are kind of for a different purpose, which makes it a little bit confusing. Basically, it gives you the capability of iterating over a list or a map and doing something to the values in that list or map, and then telling it that you want the output to take the form of either a list or a map at the end. Okay, that might sound a little confusing, so let me give a slightly more concrete example. Let's say you had a number of different names for services that you want to use, but you want to prefix the name of each of those services with some value as yet to be determined. So you have a variable called like var.prefix, and then you have a list that is your services. What you could do is use a for loop in Terraform to iterate over all of those services and return an updated list that has that prefix applied to each service name. And then you could store that in a local value for use further down in your configuration. Okay, so I'm basically able to transform all the values in a list, or I could generate a map from a list and do something to each of those values, whether I wanted to alter that value and then use the original list value as the key that points to the updated value in the map. So that's how you would use a for loop. For loops are really just for manipulating a list or a map of values within Terraform. I haven't used it a ton or at all now that I think about it, but I think for more advanced concepts, especially if you're developing modules for other teams to use, that could be a useful construct. All right, we're coming up close to time, but I have one more looping type that I want to dive into real quickly, and it's called dynamic blocks. Now, if you are familiar with the configuration blocks for resources in Terraform, you'll know that sometimes you might have multiples of a configuration of a sub block or nested block inside your resource configuration. A pretty good example of that is if you are creating a security group in AWS, you might have multiple rules inside that security group, and each of those rules is its own nested block. Now, let's say you wanted to create 20 of these rules. You could add all 20 individually, or you could have a map that stores all of the values for each rule and then use that map to dynamically create 20 blocks in the configuration. That keeps the configuration a little tidier, a little easier to look at, and the logic of the rules now gets stored in a variable that you can update the values for without changing that configuration. Again, this is great if you're developing modules for someone else to use. The way it actually works is you basically have a value, a data source that you refer to for the iterations of that dynamic block. And then it works a lot like the for each. So it'll just go through each item in your map and then create a content block based off of the values that are stored in that map. So dynamic blocks can be a little confusing, but they absolutely have a use case. It does have to be balanced a little bit with readability of the code. So sometimes you have a ton of entries and it's going to be dynamic, which makes dynamic blocks really make a lot of sense. Sometimes it makes it harder to parse out the logic of the configuration. So you really have to balance, like, do I want to make the logic of the configuration really clear, or do I want to make the configuration more readable and a little more dynamic? So those are kind of the two opposing forces there. And, that is something that is actually on the Terraform certification, is when and when not to use dynamic blocks. I think that's one of the sub objectives. So those are the 4 different looping options when it comes to using Terraform. Hopefully that was helpful for you folks out there who are, getting to know Terraform and thinking about programming constructs. I'm curious what your questions are. Or do you want me to dive deeper into one of these looping constructs in a follow-up Terraform Tuesday where I can actually have some examples in VS Code? Do you want to hear about a different topic? I'm open to whatever rabbit hole you want to go down when it comes to Terraform. So hit me up in the comments or on Twitter. It's Ned1313, or find me on LinkedIn and let me know what you want me to talk about on the next Terraform Tuesday. Tomorrow is Wednesday and I'll be back with a completely different topic. So tune in then. Until then, stay healthy and stay safe, everybody. Thank you.